with reason, measure with science, act with ethics, reduce the pain, increase the joy, humanity remains.
The concrete illusion that blinded France. Imagine pouring a massive chunk of your nation's entire wealth into constructing the most fortified, sophisticated, and expensive defensive wall known to modern human history. A subterranean megastructure stretching from hundreds of miles, equipped with electric railways, air-conditioned hospitals, and steel turrets capable of rotating 360 degrees to rain thousands of shells per minute. Now, imagine doing all of this only to discover on a single morning that your enemy did not even bother attacking your wall, but simply walked through the back door because you assumed the trees over there were too dense. This is not a fiction about absurdity. It is the real, tragic story of the French military and its empire in the mid-20th century. The true danger of the Maginot Line does not lie in its tactical failure on the battlefield, but in the cognitive and analytical breakdown that preceded the firing of a single bullet. When you look at the thousands of tons of reinforced concrete and steel poured along the eastern border of France, you are not looking at a defensive fort. You are looking at a monumentally sized physical manifestation of logical fallacies, flawed data collection, and a complete divorce from the scientific method in decision-making. Success and failure are never products of luck or chance. They are the direct consequences of a chain of deliberate or flawed decisions made within a specific context. For any human entity, be it an individual, an institution, or a sovereign state, to achieve sustainable survival and produce optimal actions, it must operate as a rational actor capable of scientific and logical thinking. This requires gathering data strictly from reality, passing it through description, criticism, and inference while actively stripping away cognitive biases. The ultimate goal of this framework is to satisfy two non-negotiable conditions, guaranteeing the survival of the group and minimizing human pain before seeking any short-term comfort. But what happens when an empire like France replaces this framework with self-deception and relies on data pulled from the past rather than the present? This is the analytical autopsy of one of the greatest strategic collapses in human history. Chapter 1. Trench Trauma and the Birth of Maginot. To understand how France arrived at this decision, we must first collect our data from a specific historical context that begins on November 11, 1918. World War I had just ended, and France had lost over 1.4 million of its young men, alongside millions of wounded and permanently disfigured soldiers. That demographic and human drain was an existential bleed that nearly destroyed the nation. Embedded deep within the collective psyche of the French leadership was a single imperative: France could not survive another war of human attrition. By 1929, the French government faced a new reality, and serving as Minister of War was André Maginot, a wounded veteran and hero of the Battle of Verdun. Maginot introduced a bill in late September 1929, which was officially ratified on January 14, 1930, allocating an initial budget of over 3 billion French francs. On the surface, the logic appeared sound: construct state-of-the-art concrete fortifications directly along the border with Germany to deter any sudden invasion, buy time for the French army to mobilize, and substitute human flesh with impenetrable concrete. However, this is precisely where the first systemic failure in data collection occurred. The French High Command, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain and General Maurice Gamelin, gathered their data from an entirely obsolete context. They took the operational data of 1914, a static war dominated by heavy artillery and fixed trenches, and inferred that all future wars would be exact carbon copies of Verdun. The French leadership fell directly into the appeal to the past fallacy, irrationally assuming that the methods and conditions that survived past attacks must inherently serve as the eternal standard for future conflict, regardless of technological evolution, mobility, or adversary doctrines. Instead of deploying a scientific methodology built on observation, critique, and adapting to modern variables like combat aviation and fast-moving radio-equipped tanks, the French strategic mind froze in 1918. They gathered data from history and constructed their logic around an emotional desire to avoid bloodshed, failing to realize that altering an action without updating the underlying framework guarantees catastrophic failure. Chapter 2: Engineering Miracles and Military Blind Spots. Between 1930 and 1936, the Maginot Line transformed into an engineering marvel of its era. The line stretched from the border of Switzerland in the south all the way to the Belgian border in the north. Deep subterranean strongholds, known as ouvrages, descended dozens of meters underground, housing internal power plants, electric train networks, advanced gas filtration systems, and bunkers designed to withstand the heaviest bombardments imaginable. On paper, this engineering satisfied the ethical imperative: minimize pain and protect human life. But the fatal flaw was not in the reinforced concrete. It was in the massive gap left open by design. The heavily fortified Maginot Line stopped abruptly at the edge of the Belgian Ardennes forest. Why? Because during a Senate committee meeting in 1934, Marshal Pétain confidently declared, "The Ardennes forest is impenetrable to armored forces, and if any enemy enters it, they will be destroyed." Here, the French military plunged into the confirmation bias, collecting only the data that supported their preconceived notion that dense trees and rough terrain served as a natural wall, while actively dismissing intelligence reports showing that the Germans were developing a doctrine based on rapid mechanized warfare. Furthermore, extending the line along the entire Belgian border presented severe political and financial hurdles. France did not want to eliminate Belgium by appearing to abandon it behind a wall. As the costs ballooned, the French High Command trapped itself inside the sunk-cost fallacy. Having invested billions of francs into the eastern forts, their logic dictated that they must double down on this defense strategy, as abandoning the concrete concept meant admitting that their astronomical investments had been a massive misallocation of national resources. In 1934, a young French officer named Charles de Gaulle published a book titled Vers l'armée des métiers, advocating for the creation of autonomous, fast-moving armored divisions, and warning that static walls cannot protect a nation if an enemy simply drives around them. Yet, the military establishment rejected de Gaulle's critique. They discarded the second pillar of the scientific method, criticism, and preferred the psychological comfort of an illusion over the harsh reality of modern military science. Chapter 3: May 1940 and the Collapse of French Rationality. On May 10, 1940, reality collided with illusion, laying bare the truth of the battlefield. Germany launched Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow. The operational plan, designed by General Erich von Manstein and championed by Heinz Guderian, used a decoy attack into Belgium and the Netherlands to draw Allied forces north while pushing the main mass of German armor, nearly 2,500 tanks and mechanized vehicles, straight through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. In just 3 days, between May 13th and May 14th, 1940, German armored corps crossed the Ardennes and breached French defenses at Sedan along the Meuse River. The formidable Maginot Line was not stormed, it was completely bypassed from the north and west. Billions of francs in fortifications, advanced artillery, and hundreds of thousands of stationed troops were rendered completely useless without firing a single shot at the primary invasion force, as German armies encircled them from behind and severed their supply lines. During these critical hours, the French High Command succumbed to the wishful thinking fallacy, initially dismissing the German movement as a minor distraction that could easily be contained, and refusing to update their operational data despite aerial reconnaissance confirming a massive armored column stretching over 150 miles through the forest. This complete failure to process real-time data paralyzed French command actions. Instead of producing decisions that preserved the state and reduced suffering, the absence of logical and scientific processing led to the exact opposite. By June 22, 1940, mere 6 weeks after the invasion began, France signed an armistice in the very same railway car where it had celebrated victory in 1918. The French military and civilian population became victims of an institutionally blind decision-making chain, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths, national occupation, and the complete collapse of state survival. Chapter 4. Anatomizing the institutional and ethical collapse of France. A deep structural autopsy of the French military's decisions revealed that their defeat was not caused merely by German technological superiority, but by a fundamental breakdown in methodology. For an action to be rational and effective, an institution must gather contextual data without bias, pass it through description, subject it to relentless critique, and draw unvarnished inferences. The French military failed at the description phase because it categorized the tank merely as an infantry support weapon rather than a concentrated instrument of shock warfare. It failed at the critique phase because any officer who questioned the efficacy of the Maginot Line was dismissed as an alarmist. And it failed at the inference phase because it concluded that the physical security of concrete exempted the military from the need for operational adaptability. Furthermore, French strategy crumbled when evaluated against the 2 core ethical filters. First, the filter of human and institutional survival. The obsession with the illusory safety of the Maginot Line led to the total loss of French sovereignty and the destruction of the Republic in just 6 weeks. Second, the filter of prioritizing pain reduction over comfort. The French leadership believed they were choosing the path of least resistance by avoiding mobile warfare and retreating into the psychological comfort of concrete bunkers. However, pursuing short-term comfort over genuine pain reduction through scientific adaptation resulted in catastrophic long-term suffering, total defeat, national occupation, and immense human loss. Even after war was declared, France engaged in what became known as the Phony War between September 1939 and May 1940. For 9 whole months, while the bulk of the German army was engaged in Poland, the French military possessed a window to launch an offensive on Germany's lightly defended western border. Yet their commitment to static defense trapped them in the false security fallacy, granting Germany the time needed to conquer Poland, reorganize its forces, and execute a flawless strike against France. Conclusion. Mental walls and the echoes of history. In the final analysis, the Maginot Line did not fall because its concrete was brittle or its guns failed to fire. It failed because the strategic mind behind it was intellectually dead long before construction ever began. The Maginot Line stands in the ledger of history not as an engineering achievement, but as a warning of what happens when institutional leadership rejects scientific observation, critique, and adaptation. When logic and empirical analysis are discarded, decisions devolve into wishful thinking and cognitive biases. When institutions refuse to critique their own assumptions, their most advanced tools become useless artifacts in a dynamic world. The generals of France attempted to purchase safety and ethics through steel and concrete, only to reap ruin and humiliation, proving that security is never built through static walls, but through rational minds that gather data objectively, analyze it ruthlessly, and act decisively to ensure survival and minimize human pain. The true wall that destroyed France was never built out of concrete on the border. It was built out of dogma inside the French General Staff in Paris. What did you gain from the video?